The crystal chandeliers threw dancing light across 500 upturned faces. The groom stood at the microphone, his voice trembling with emotion. "Before we continue," he said, "there's someone here I need to introduce, someone who changed my life forever." Every head turned, searching, wondering, and then he said her name. What happened next? The gasps, the silence, the collective shame that washed over that room. Well, that's a story about assumption, dignity, and the moment when truth finally demands to be heard. But to understand why that moment mattered, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret Davis had been awake since 4:30 that morning, not because she wanted to be. At 62 years old, her body simply didn't sleep the way it used to. The arthritis in her knees announced itself before dawn, a persistent ache that pulled her from dreams she could never quite remember. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment in southeast Baltimore, the kind of neighborhood where people still said good morning to strangers and corner stores knew your name. Her building was old, built in the 1960s, with radiators that clanked through the night and water pressure that varied depending on how many neighbors were showering. But it was hers. Or rather, she rented it. Had been for 11 years now, ever since her husband Thomas passed. The apartment walls were covered with photographs, graduation pictures, wedding photos, yellowed at the edges, birthday parties and Easter Sundays and Christmas mornings stretching back decades. In the center of her mantel sat a photo of a young black boy, maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a trophy nearly as big as he was. Margaret smiled at that photo every morning. Had done so for 23 years. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. Instant coffee, the expensive kind, was beyond her budget. 2 pieces of wheat toast with margarine, never butter. She took her blood pressure medication with the first sip of coffee, exactly as Dr. Chen had instructed. Through her kitchen window, she could see the sun beginning to rise over the row houses across the street. Mrs. Patterson was already on her stoop, despite the early hour. The woman was 91 and refused to miss a sunrise, said she'd earned every single one. Margaret understood that feeling. She worked as a home health aide, had done so for the past 18 years. Before that, she'd been a nurse's assistant at Johns Hopkins for 12 years. Before that, she'd worked 3 jobs simultaneously while Thomas was in graduate school, studying engineering at Morgan State. People assumed things about Margaret when they saw her. They saw the simple clothes from discount stores, the off-brand purse she'd carried for 6 years, the sensible shoes with the worn heels. They saw a woman who took the bus because she didn't have a car, who brought her lunch in a reusable container because restaurants were too expensive. They weren't wrong about the details. They just didn't understand the reasons. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, were the bank statements in her desk drawer, the investment portfolio Thomas had set up before he died, the life insurance policy that had finally paid out after 2 years of legal battles, the modest inheritance from her mother's estate. What they didn't see was that Margaret Davis lived simply not because she had to, but because she'd learned that dignity wasn't measured in designer labels or luxury cars. Her current patient, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, lived in Roland Park, one of Baltimore's wealthiest neighborhoods. Margaret took 2 buses to get there 5 days a week. The commute took an hour and 15 minutes each way. She didn't mind. Mrs. Hartwell had been a civil rights attorney in the 1960s, had marched with Dr. King, had scars on her legs from police dogs in Birmingham. At 87, her body was failing, but her mind remained sharp as ever. She and Margaret talked about everything: politics, history, the state of the world. "You remind me of my daughter," Mrs. Hartwell had said once. "Not in looks, in spirit, that quiet strength that people mistake for weakness until they learn better." Margaret had simply smiled. She'd learned long ago that some compliments didn't need a response. The wedding invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded through Mrs. Hartwell's attorney. Margaret had stared at it for a long time. Heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, the kind of invitation that cost more than she spent on groceries in a week. It announced the marriage of James Michael Hartwell to Catherine Elizabeth Morrison at the Baltimore Country Club, with reception to follow. James Hartwell. The gap-toothed boy in her photograph, all grown up now. A man of 30 with a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and a surgical residency at Massachusetts General. A man she hadn't seen in person in 7 years, though they talked on the phone every few months. A man who called her Aunt Maggie even though they shared no blood. The invitation included a handwritten note on expensive stationery. Aunt Maggie, I know it's far, and I know you'll say you don't want to impose, but this day wouldn't mean anything without you there. Please come, I've already arranged everything. Love, James. Inside the envelope was a round-trip train ticket from Baltimore to Boston, first class, a reservation at the Four Seasons for 2 nights, and a check to cover any expenses. Margaret had cried when she saw it. Then she'd called Mrs. Hartwell's granddaughter to ask if she could take the weekend off. Then she'd gone to Macy's just this once, and bought a dress. Not expensive. She couldn't bring herself to spend that way, but new, elegant in its simplicity. Navy blue with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. $49 on clearance. It would do. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the dress would become part of a story people would tell for years to come. That something as simple as fabric and thread would become evidence in a trial of character. If only she had known, she might have chosen differently, but probably not. Margaret had never been the type to let other people's judgments dictate her choices. The Baltimore Country Club stood on a hill overlooking the water, all white columns and manicured lawns. Valet parking attendants in crisp uniforms directed luxury cars, Mercedes, BMWs, the occasional Tesla. Margaret arrived in an Uber. The driver, a young man named Ahmed, helped her with her small overnight bag. Beautiful venue, he said. Special occasion? A wedding, Margaret replied. Someone very important to me. Well, you look lovely, ma'am. Have a wonderful time. She tipped him $20, more than the fare. He'd been kind, and kindness deserved recognition. The lobby was already bustling with wedding guests. Women in designer dresses that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Men in custom suits. Jewelry that caught the light and threw it back in expensive sparkles. Margaret smoothed her navy dress and walked to the reception desk. Good afternoon, she said to the young woman behind the counter. I'm checking in. Margaret Davis. The receptionist, blonde, early 20s, with the kind of polish that came from expensive schools and country club summers typed into her computer. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry, she said, her voice taking on a particular tone Margaret recognized immediately. I don't see your name on our guest list for the Hartwell-Morrison wedding. It should be there, Margaret said patiently. James Hartwell made the reservation himself. The receptionist's eyes traveled from Margaret's face to her dress to her worn handbag to her sensible shoes. The assessment took less than 3 seconds. Ma'am, are you sure you have the right hotel? The Holiday Inn Express is about 5 miles down the road. They might have better. Rates, the words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger, not yet, just a familiar, weary recognition. After 62 years of being black in America, she knew this dance by heart. I'm quite sure, she said, her voice steady. Please check again. The reservation was made under James Hartwell's name for his guest, Margaret Davis. The receptionist sighed audibly, as though Margaret were being deliberately difficult. She picked up the phone. Security. We have a situation in the lobby. What the receptionist didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the elderly black woman she was treating like an intruder had helped pay for James Hartwell's first year of medical school when his scholarship fell through. That she'd sat with him in hospital waiting rooms when his mother was dying. That she'd driven him to college interviews and edited his application essays and believed in him when he stopped believing in himself. What she didn't know was that the situation she was creating would become the story that wedding guests remembered longer than the ceremony itself. But she was about to learn. In the worst possible way, the security guard arrived within minutes. He was older, probably in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent time in the military. His name tag read Dennis Morrison. What seems to be the problem? He asked. The receptionist gestured toward Margaret with barely concealed impatience. This woman claims to be a wedding guest, but her name isn't on our list. I see. Dennis turned to Margaret, his expression neutral but his eyes not unkind. Ma'am, can you tell me who you're here to see? James Hartwell, Margaret said. I'm a family friend. He made my hotel reservation. And your name? Margaret Davis. Dennis pulled out a tablet and scrolled through a list. His finger stopped. Here you are, Suite 412. First-class accommodation prepaid for 2 nights. He looked at the receptionist. She's on the list, Sarah, right here. Sarah's face flushed. That can't be. I looked under D for Davis. It's listed under Hartwell's guest list, Dennis explained. Then to Margaret, my apologies for the confusion, Ms. Davis. Let me personally escort you to your room. But Sarah wasn't done. Wait, she said. We need to verify identification for security purposes. This was new. Margaret had checked into dozens of hotels over the years. No one had ever asked to verify her identification beyond the standard ID check. Dennis's expression tightened slightly. Sarah, that's not. Policy is policy, Sarah insisted, her voice sharp now. Especially for first-class suites, we need to ensure there's no fraud. Of course, Margaret said quietly. She pulled her driver's license from her wallet and placed it on the counter. Sarah examined it as though looking for evidence of forgery, held it up to the light. Compared the photo to Margaret's face multiple times. Pa's other guests were beginning to notice. A couple in their 40s, dripping in wealth, exchanged glances. An older woman with silver hair whispered something to her companion. Margaret stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her face composed. She'd learned decades ago that reacting to this kind of treatment only made it worse. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here, not now. Everything appears to be in order, Sarah finally said, as though disappointed. She handed back the license with obvious reluctance. But I'll need to call Mr. Hartwell to confirm. Sarah, this is unnecessary, Dennis said, his voice firm now. The reservation is legitimate, her ID matches. She's clearly on the guest list. I'm just being thorough, Margaret spoke softly. Please go ahead and call, I don't mind waiting. What she didn't add, I've been waiting my whole life. What's another few minutes? Sarah picked up the phone, dialed, waited. Mr. Hartwell's phone is going to voicemail. She seemed almost pleased. He's probably getting ready for his rehearsal dinner, Margaret said. It starts in an hour. Then you'll have to wait until I can reach him. Dennis looked like he wanted to object, but Margaret shook her head slightly. She'd fought enough battles in her life to know which ones to engage in and which to endure. I'll wait in the lobby, she said. She found a chair near the window, sat down with her small bag at her feet and folded her hands in her lap, and watched as, one by one, other guests arrived, checked in without incident. Without ID verification, without suspicion. Every single one of them white. 30 minutes passed, then 45. The rehearsal dinner was in 15 minutes. Margaret could see the wedding party beginning to gather on the terrace, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. James was there, tall and handsome in a navy suit, laughing at something his best man said. She could walk out there right now, end this, but something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the understanding that if she made a scene, she'd become the problem, the difficult guest, the one who disrupted things on James's special weekend. So she waited. Sarah was helping another guest now, an elderly white couple. Smiling, friendly, efficient, their check-in took less than 2 minutes. As they walked away, the woman glanced at Margaret. Leaned close to her husband, whispered something. The husband looked back, frowned slightly. Then they both hurried toward the elevators. Margaret had seen that look before. Curiosity mixed with concern. The unspoken question, should someone do something about her? Music shift, subtle tension building, 50 minutes now. Through the window, she could see guests moving toward the private dining room for the rehearsal dinner. James kept checking his phone, looking around, clearly searching for someone. For her. If she could just catch his attention, just wave. But she was 3 stories below, separated by glass and distance and the weight of assumption. Sarah made another call. Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw the receptionist's expression shift from officious to uncertain to something that might have been alarm. Dennis reappeared. He walked straight to Margaret. Ms. Davis, he said quietly, I'm truly sorry about this. I've been on the phone with management. Your room is ready. Let me take you up personally. Sarah appeared behind him, her face pale now. Ms. Davis, I apologize for the delay if you'll just... But Margaret was already standing, not quickly, not with anger. Just with the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived worse than this and would undoubtedly survive more. Thank you, Dennis, she said. I appreciate your help. As they walked toward the elevator, Margaret heard Sarah on the phone again. Her voice was different now, Worried. In the elevator, Dennis spoke. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened. But it did happen, Margaret said gently. And I suspect it happens more often than we'd like to believe. You're right about that. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor. Suite 412 was at the end of a long, carpeted hallway. Dennis unlocked the door. Margaret stepped inside and nearly gasped. The room was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. A king-size bed with what had to be 1,000 thread-count sheets. A sitting area with a sofa and chairs. Fresh flowers on every surface. A welcome basket with champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries. And on the desk, a framed photograph. Margaret walked over, tears suddenly blurring her vision. It was the same photo she kept on her mantel, 7-year-old James with his trophy. But this one had an inscription on the frame. To Aunt Maggie, who taught me that winning isn't about trophies. It's about character. Love always, James. She sat down on the bed, the photograph in her hands, and allowed herself to cry, just for a moment. Then she washed her face, fixed her makeup, and went downstairs to find her boy. The rehearsal dinner was already in full swing by the time Margaret arrived. She stood at the entrance of the private dining room, taking in the scene. Round tables draped in ivory linens, centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus, crystal glasses catching the candlelight. 50 or so guests, all dressed impeccably, all laughing and chatting with the ease of people who belonged. James stood near the bar with his groomsmen, his back to the door. Margaret was about to call out to him when a woman appeared at her elbow. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice professionally pleasant but firm. "This is a private event. The hotel's restaurant is on the 1st floor if you're looking for dinner." Margaret turned. The woman was perhaps 40, wearing a tailored black dress and a Bluetooth earpiece. Event coordinator, Margaret guessed, doing her job, protecting her client's exclusive event from intruders. "I'm a guest," Margaret said. "James Hartwell invited me." The woman's eyes did that same assessment. Dress, shoes, handbag, age, race, the calculation was swift and certain. "I don't think so," she said, not unkindly. "This is an intimate gathering, family and close friends only." "I am close, miss, please. I don't want to make a scene. If you'll just Aunt Maggie." The voice cut through the din of conversation. James's voice, and suddenly he was there pushing through the crowd, his face lit up with joy. He wrapped Margaret in a hug that lifted her slightly off her feet, the way he used to when he was a teenager and wanted to make her laugh. "You made it." "I was getting worried." "I kept checking my phone," he pulled back, really looking at her. "Are you okay? You look upset." "I'm fine, sweetheart, just a little mix-up at check-in." The event coordinator had gone very still. Very quiet, James's eyes found her. "Jennifer, is there a problem?" "No, Mr. Hartwell, I didn't realize." "I thought, this is Margaret Davis," James said, his arm still around Margaret's shoulders. "The woman I told you about." "The guest of honor." Jennifer's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession. "Of course, I apologize, I didn't see her on the—" "She's on the list. I put her there myself." His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "Along with a note specifying that she gets whatever she needs whenever she needs it." "Yes, of course." "Again, my apologies, Ms. Davis." Margaret nodded, said nothing. What was there to say? James led her to the head table, right next to where he'd be sitting. As they walked, Margaret felt the eyes following them. The confusion, the whispered questions. Who is she? Why is she at the head table? Is she family? At the table, James introduced her to his best man, his college roommate, 2 groomsmen. They were polite, shook her hand, smiled, but she could see the questions in their eyes, too. Then a woman approached. Late 50s, blonde, with the kind of beauty that came from excellent genetics and better cosmetic surgery. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Margaret's first car. "James, darling," she said, kissing him on both cheeks. "You didn't tell me we'd have additional guests." Her eyes were on Margaret, not hostile, just assessing. "Mom, this is Margaret Davis." "Aunt Maggie, this is Catherine's mother, Patricia Morrison." "How lovely," Patricia said, extending a hand with obvious reluctance. "Any friend of James's is welcome, of course." The word friend carried weight, distance. "Thank you for having me," Margaret said. "Are you from Baltimore?" "I don't recall seeing you at any of the family gatherings." "I am. I've known James since he was 7. "How wonderful, and what do you do?" The question wasn't innocent. Margaret had been asked this question 1,000 times before, and she always knew what was really being asked. What's your status? Do you belong here? I'm a home health aide, Margaret said simply. The change in Patricia's expression was subtle but unmistakable. A slight withdrawal, a recalculation of importance. How nice, she said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. James has always been so, democratic in his friendships. Pause, democratic, as though caring about someone beyond your social class was an eccentric personality trait. James's jaw tightened. Aunt Maggie is family, Mrs. Morrison, not a friendship, family. Of course, dear, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. Patricia placed a hand on James's arm. Catherine is looking for you. Something about the seating chart for tomorrow. He looked torn, glanced at Margaret. Go, she said softly. I'm fine. He squeezed her hand and left. Margaret sat down at the empty seat next to James's place card, alone at a table surrounded by strangers. A server appeared. Can I get you something to drink? Just water, please. We have champagne, open bar. Water is perfect. The server left, returned with water in a crystal glass. Margaret sipped it, watching the room. People clustered in groups, laughing, celebrating. James was across the room now with Catherine, a lovely young woman with dark hair and a warm smile. They looked happy together. That was all that mattered, Margaret told herself. But then she heard it, the voices from the table behind her. I don't understand why James invited the help. Maybe she took care of his grandmother or something. Still, this is a black tie event. It's uncomfortable. Did you see her dress? Poor thing probably spent her whole paycheck on it. Someone should tell James this is inappropriate. This is Catherine's special weekend. They weren't whispering quietly enough. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her water glass. She could leave. Should leave, maybe, go back to her suite, order room service. Let James enjoy his evening without the complication of her presence. But then she remembered something Thomas used to say. Your presence in spaces that don't expect you is revolutionary, Maggie. Don't ever forget that. So she stayed, sat up straighter, kept her chin up. And when the server returned to ask if she'd changed her mind about that champagne, she said yes. Dinner was a 7-course affair. Each course announced by the catering manager with flourish. The conversation at Margaret's table was polite but distant. James's groomsmen made efforts to include her, but she could feel the disconnect. They talked about medical school, residency programs, hospitals she'd never heard of. She listened, smiled, said little. Between the 3rd and 4th courses, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, then stood abruptly. Excuse me, he said to the table. I need to make a call. He walked out to the terrace, phone pressed to his ear. Through the windows, Margaret could see his expression changing. Concern, then something harder, anger. He was out there for 15 minutes. When he returned, his face was composed, but Margaret knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw. Everything okay? She asked quietly. Fine, he said. But his hand was clenched around his phone. Later, as dessert was being served, some kind of deconstructed tiramisu that looked more like art than food, Patricia Morrison stood and tapped her champagne glass with a fork. The room quieted. I just want to say a few words, Patricia began, her voice carrying perfectly across the room. As Catherine's mother, I couldn't be more thrilled about this wedding. James is exactly the kind of man we'd hoped our daughter would find. Educated, accomplished, from a good family. She paused, scanning the room, her eyes passing over Margaret without stopping. Tomorrow, when they exchange vows, they'll be joining 2 families who share the same values, the same background, the same understanding of what matters in life. Some people might have missed it. The subtle emphasis on same, the implication of exclusion. Margaret didn't miss it. Neither did James. His hand found Margaret's under the table, squeezed it. Patricia continued. Catherine and James have built something beautiful together. And I know that as they move forward, surrounded by their community, the people who truly know and understand them, they'll continue to thrive. The speech went on, but Margaret had stopped listening. The people who truly know and understand them. She looked down at her plate, at her hands, at the simple dress she'd been so proud of just hours ago. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. After the speeches, people mingled. The younger guests migrated toward the bar. The older guests clustered in groups, talking about golf handicaps and vacation homes and market volatility. Margaret stayed in her seat, A woman approached, 60ish, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a simple black dress and pearls. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. "Please." The woman sat down, extended her hand. "Eleanor Hartwell, James's grandmother." Margaret's eyes widened. "Mrs. Hartwell, I didn't realize you'd be here. James said you weren't well enough to travel." "I told him that," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "But when my only grandson gets married, I make an exception. Even if it means traveling with an oxygen tank and a very patient nurse." She gestured toward a younger woman standing nearby. "That's Diane. She keeps me alive. It's wonderful to meet you, and you must be Margaret Davis." "I am. James talks about you constantly, has since he was a boy." Eleanor leaned closer. "He called me this afternoon, told me about the situation at check-in, and I suspect tonight hasn't been much better." Margaret said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said simply. "People can be limited in their imagination. They see what they expect to see and nothing more. It's fine. It's not fine. But I appreciate your grace." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Eleanor spoke again. "Do you know why James became a doctor? He always wanted to help people." "True. But do you know the specific moment he decided?" Eleanor paused. "He was 12. His mother was dying, breast cancer. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. But you found a clinical trial, called every hospital on the East Coast, found a doctor in Philadelphia who was willing to see her." Margaret remembered. She'd made 53 phone calls over 2 days. "It didn't save her," Eleanor continued, "but it gave her 6 more months, 6 months to see James graduate from middle school. To tell him she was proud, to say goodbye properly." Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. "He told me once that you taught him that caring isn't passive. That love is an action verb." Pause. Margaret felt tears building. "What I'm trying to say," Eleanor said, "is that you belong here more than any of these people. Because you're not just a guest at this wedding, you're the reason there's a wedding at all." Before Margaret could respond, there was a commotion near the entrance. Catherine's father, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit, was speaking loudly to one of the hotel staff. His voice carried across the room. "I don't care if it's policy. I want those security tapes from this afternoon. Someone made a serious error in judgment, and I want to know who." James appeared at his side. "Mr. Morrison, it's really not necessary." "It absolutely is necessary. This is one of Baltimore's premier venues. We're paying them a significant sum, and they treated a guest, your guest, with disrespect. That's unacceptable." People were staring now. The room had gone quiet. Catherine hurried over. "Dad, please, James says it's fine. Let's not make a scene." "This isn't about making a scene. It's about principle." He turned to the hotel manager, who'd appeared looking deeply uncomfortable. "I want a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning. Who was involved? What happened? And what steps you're taking to ensure it never happens again." The manager nodded vigorously. "Of course, Mr. Morrison, I'll personally handle." And, Mr. Morrison continued, "I want a written apology delivered to Ms. Davis's room tonight, along with a complimentary upgrade and a full refund of all charges associated with her stay." "Dad," Catherine said quietly, "this is embarrassing her." All eyes had turned to Margaret. She stood slowly, walked over to where the men were standing. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I appreciate your concern, but it's truly not necessary. I'm fine. With all due respect, Davis, it is necessary. My daughter is marrying into a family that clearly values loyalty and character. That young man over there," he gestured toward James, "talks about you with the kind of love most people reserve for their own parents. If someone hurt you, they hurt my future son-in-law. And that makes it my business." Margaret didn't know what to say. Mr. Morrison turned back to the manager. "Tomorrow morning, first thing." Then he offered Margaret his arm. "May I escort you back to your table?" She took it. As they walked across the room, every single person watched. The whispers would start soon, Margaret knew. Who was she? What was her connection? Why did Mr. Morrison, one of Boston's most powerful attorneys, defend her so fiercely? But in that moment, walking arm in arm with a man who'd stood up for her without being asked, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in hours. Seen. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Margaret woke early in her suite, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She ordered room service, something she never did, and ate breakfast looking out over the harbor. On the desk was an envelope that had been slipped under her door sometime during the night. Inside was a handwritten note on the hotel's letterhead. Dear Ms. Davis, please accept our sincerest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you received upon your arrival. We are conducting a full investigation and taking corrective action with all staff involved. Your entire stay has been comped, and we hope you'll allow us the opportunity to restore your faith in our establishment. With deepest regret, Michael Chen, General Manager. Below that was another note, this one on the country club stationery. Ms. Davis, I'm writing on behalf of the country club's board of directors to apologize for yesterday's events. Sarah Mitchell has been suspended pending review, and we're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff. We hope this doesn't overshadow what should be a joyful occasion. Respectfully, Patricia Ashford, board president. Margaret set the letters aside. The apologies were nice, but they didn't change what had happened, didn't erase the assumptions, didn't undo the humiliation. Still, it was something. She spent the morning getting ready with the kind of care she usually reserved for church on Easter, the navy dress. Her good shoes, the ones without the worn heels, the pearl earrings Thomas had given her on their 20th anniversary, simple, dignified, herself. At 2 o'clock, she made her way down to the ceremony space. The country club's main ballroom had been transformed. White chairs arranged in rows, an aisle carpeted in white rose petals. An altar draped in ivory silk with massive floral arrangements. Chandeliers dimmed to create a romantic glow. 500 seats, all filled with Boston and Baltimore's elite. Margaret's seat was in the 4th row, center aisle. A small card with her name in calligraphy rested on the seat. She sat down. Around her, people chatted and laughed, compared designer outfits. Discussed the Dacre. Margaret recognized some faces from the rehearsal dinner. None of them acknowledged her. That was fine. She hadn't come for them. The music changed. The processional began. Bridesmaids in champagne-colored dresses. Groomsmen in black tuxedos. Catherine's father escorting her down the aisle, her dress a waterfall of silk and lace. And then James, standing at the altar, his eyes bright with tears as he watched his bride approach. Margaret's breath caught. He looked so much like Thomas in that moment. The same expression Thomas had worn on their wedding day, wonder mixed with joy mixed with the weight of promise. The ceremony was beautiful, traditional vows, a reading from Corinthians. An exchange of rings. I now pronounce you husband and wife. The kiss, the applause, the recessional. And then it was over, and guests were being ushered toward the reception ballroom. The reception hall was even more elaborate than the ceremony space. Round tables draped in champagne linens. Centerpieces of white orchids and roses standing 3 feet tall. Crystal stemware that caught the light from dozens of chandeliers. A live band setting up in the corner. A dance floor polished to a mirror shine. Margaret found her table, table 4. She was seated with Alina Hartwell, Catherine's great-aunt, and several other older relatives. Saved you a seat, Alina said warmly, patting the chair beside her. Margaret sat down gratefully. The first course arrived, then the second. People moved between tables, greeting friends, taking photos. Catherine and James made their rounds, thanking guests for coming. When they reached table 4, Catherine hugged her great-aunt. Then she turned to Margaret. Ms. Davis, she said warmly, I'm so glad you could make it. James has told me so much about you. Congratulations, dear. You look beautiful. Thank you. Catherine glanced at James. My husband has been very insistent that we do something special during the reception. I didn't understand why until my father told me what happened yesterday. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Catherine, please, it's your day. Don't. No, Catherine said firmly. It's our day. Mine and James's. And there are some things that need to be said. She squeezed Margaret's hand and moved on to the next table. Margaret looked at Alina. What is she talking about? Alina just smiled. You'll see. After dinner, the best man gave his toast. Funny stories about James in medical school, jokes about his competitiveness. Warm wishes for the future. Then Catherine's maid of honor spoke, sweet memories of childhood, inside jokes, tears and laughter. Then the band leader spoke into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, the groom has asked for a moment to say a few words. James stood up, walked to the microphone. The room quieted. Thank you all for being here, he began. Catherine and I are overwhelmed by the love in this room. He paused. But before we continue with the celebration, there's something I need to do. Someone I need to honor. He looked directly at Margaret. Her heart started pounding. When I was 7 years old, James said, my father left, just disappeared. My mother was working 2 jobs trying to keep us afloat. We were living in East Baltimore in a neighborhood most people avoid. We were poor, struggling, scared. The room was silent now. Completely silent. Our neighbor was a woman named Margaret Davis. She was a nurse's assistant at Hopkins. She had her own problems, her own struggles. But she saw a little black boy who needed help, and she didn't look away. Pause. She tutored me in reading when I was behind in school. She made sure I had school supplies. She drove me to the library every Saturday. When my mother got sick cancer, Margaret was the one who researched treatments, who found doctors, who held my mother's hand during chemo while I sat in the waiting room doing homework. Tears were streaming down his face now. When my mother died, I was 15. I had nowhere to go. The state wanted to put me in foster care, but Margaret, who was dealing with her own husband's terminal illness, became my legal guardian. She took me in, fed me, clothed me, kept me in school. People were crying now. Margaret could see them, women dabbing their eyes, men clearing their throats. When I got into Johns Hopkins for undergrad, I couldn't afford it. The scholarship didn't cover everything. I was going to defer work for a year, save money. But Margaret, who was living on a nurse assistant's salary, took out a loan. A loan she's probably still paying off. Margaret closed her eyes. She put me through undergrad, through medical school, through residency interviews. She never asked for anything back. Never made me feel like I owed her. She just loved me like a son. Slow down, James walked away from the microphone, across the ballroom, directly to Margaret's table. He knelt beside her chair. Aunt Maggie, he said, his voice breaking, I'm so sorry for what happened when you arrived, for how people treated you, for the assumptions they made. James, please. Let me finish. He took her hands in his. You taught me that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars or degrees or designer clothes. You taught me that dignity is quiet and grace is strong and love is sacrifice. He stood, pulling her to her feet. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, I'd like you to meet Dr. Margaret Davis. A collective gasp. Doctor, someone whispered. James continued. What most people don't know about Aunt Maggie is that she has a PhD in education from Morgan State University. She taught elementary school for 15 years before becoming a nurse's assistant to help pay for her husband's cancer treatment. Before that, she was a civil rights activist who marched with Dr. King. She's published 3 papers on early childhood literacy. She's volunteered at her church's food bank every week for 20 years. Music shift, swelling, emotional. But more than any of that, James said, she's the woman who saved my life not once. Not twice, but every single day for 18 years. He gestured toward the head table. The man who walked me down the aisle today, that's Dr. Robert Chen, chief of surgery at Mass General. My mentor, my boss. He's an amazing man, and I'm honored he agreed to stand in for my father. He paused. But the person who truly deserves that honor, the person who raised me, who shaped me, who made me the man I am today, is standing right here. Pause, let it breathe. Aunt Maggie. Will you come stand with me? The room erupted. Not just applause, a standing ovation. 500 people on their feet. Margaret stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. James took her hand and led her to the center of the dance floor. The band began to play. What a wonderful world. May I have this dance? James asked. Margaret could barely speak. I'm not much of a dancer. You taught me how to dance before my first school formal, remember, in your living room. Stepping on your toes the whole time. They swayed together while 500 people watched. And in that moment, Margaret Davis, who'd been dismissed, underestimated, judged, and humiliated, stood in the center of a ballroom surrounded by Boston's elite, dancing with the young man she'd raised. While everyone who doubted her worth watched in silence, after the dance, people approached Margaret in waves. Catherine's mother, Patricia, was first. Her eyes were red from crying. Dr. Davis, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. More than an apology, I made assumptions based on. Well, based on things that don't matter, I'm sorry. I appreciate that, Margaret said. James told us you work as a home health aide now. May I ask why? Margaret smiled. Because after my husband died, I needed something to do, something meaningful. And I'd rather spend my time caring for people who need help than sitting in an empty house collecting a pension. Patricia nodded slowly. That's beautiful, actually. Others came. The bridesmaids who'd ignored her, the groomsmen who'd patronized her, the guests who'd whispered, all of them apologetic, all of them ashamed. Mr. Morrison approached with a champagne glass in hand. Dr. Davis, he said, I want to formally apologize for not doing more research before the weekend. If I'd known about your credentials, about your history with James, you would have treated me differently, Margaret finished gently. I know, but that's exactly the problem, isn't it? The way people should be treated shouldn't depend on their credentials. He considered this. You're absolutely right. And I'm grateful you've taught me that lesson. Sarah, the hotel receptionist, appeared at the edge of the crowd. She looked terrified. Dr. Davis, she said, her voice shaking. I came to apologize in person. I was wrong. I let my assumptions cloud my professionalism. I'm sorry. Margaret looked at her, really looked at her. A young woman, early 20s. Trying to do her job, raised in a world that taught her certain lessons about who belongs where. Apology accepted, Margaret said. But Sarah, yes, I hope you remember this. Not because I want you to feel guilty, but because the next time you see someone who doesn't fit your expectations, you'll pause. You'll consider that maybe, just maybe, you don't know the whole story. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. I will. I promise. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who wanted to know her story, where she grew up, how she met James, what she was doing now. She answered patiently. Graciously, but what she didn't tell them, what she would never tell them, was how much those first hours had hurt, how close she'd come to leaving. How many times in her life she'd endured exactly this kind of treatment and simply swallowed it. Because that wasn't the point of tonight. The point was watching James dance with his new wife. Seeing him happy, knowing that all those years of sacrifice had led to this moment, that was enough. More than enough. As the reception wound down, Eleanor Hartwell found Margaret on the terrace looking out over the lights of the harbor. Quite an evening, Eleanor said. That's one way to put it. James told me he almost canceled the wedding. Margaret turned, shocked. What? When he found out what happened at check-in. When he heard the way people were treating you. He called me and said he couldn't go through with it. Couldn't celebrate with people who would disrespect the woman who raised him. Oh, James. I talked him out of it, Eleanor continued. Told him that the best way to honor you was to show everyone exactly who you are, what you mean to him, to make them face their own assumptions. She paused. Because that's what this was really about, you know, not credentials or accomplishments. Those are just proxies for worth. What tonight taught these people, what you taught them, is that their measuring sticks are broken. Margaret thought about that. I don't know if everyone learned that lesson, she said quietly. Some people apologized because James is important to them, not because they truly understood. You're probably right, Eleanor admitted. But some people did learn. I saw it in their faces. The real shame, the genuine remorse, that's something. It's something, Margaret agreed. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights dance on the water. Can I tell you what I learned? Eleanor asked. Of course. I learned that grace doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It means maintaining your dignity while refusing to let others diminish you. You did that tonight. You didn't lash out, didn't demand recognition. You just existed with quiet power. And somehow that was more devastating than any accusation could have been. Margaret felt tears building again. Thank you. No, Eleanor said firmly. Thank you for raising that young man in there. For showing him what real character looks like. For being exactly who you are, regardless of who's watching. Margaret left the reception at 11, not because she wasn't welcome. Not because she felt uncomfortable, but because she was 62 years old and tired, and the young people needed to celebrate without worrying about the older generation. James walked her to her suite. You didn't have to do all that, she said as they rode the elevator. Yes, I did. I mean the speech, the dance. Making such a big deal, Aunt Maggie. He took her hands. You made me, not just raised me, made me. Every good thing I am, every right choice I've made, every time I've chosen compassion over convenience, that's you. That's what you taught me. She cupped his face in her hands. I'm so proud of you. I love you. I love you too, baby. He kissed her forehead and left. Margaret went into her suite, kicked off her good shoes, and sat by the window. Tomorrow she'd take the train back to Baltimore. back to her one-bedroom apartment and Mrs. Hartwell and her simple life. But tonight she'd stood in the center of a ballroom while 500 people rose to their feet for her. Not because of her degrees, not because of her accomplishments, but because a young man she'd loved like a son refused to let the world diminish her worth. That was enough. That was everything. Pause if this story moved you, if it reminded you that worth isn't measured in dollars or designer labels, that dignity is quiet but powerful, that the people we underestimate are often the ones who have earned respect most deeply. Then I hope you'll subscribe. These are the stories that matter, the ones that remind us of who we want to be, because somewhere right now there's another Margaret Davis, another person being underestimated, another quiet warrior maintaining dignity in the face of assumption, and their story deserves to be told too. But that story, the one about what happened when a homeless veteran walked into a corporate boardroom and shocked every executive there, well, that's a story for next time. Until then, remember, everyone you meet is carrying a story you can't see. Everyone deserves the dignity you'd want for yourself, and sometimes, just sometimes, the truth finds its way to the light.